We cannot have this market-dominated economy, and we cannot have the integration and the opening up of every economy and every sector in every economy to global forces. And global forces means transnational corporations, mainly from the highly industrialized countries. So we are not surprised, the leaders are very surprised that the financial sector has imploded. But social movement analysts, critical analysts, have been saying for many decades, you cannot have this total freedom for these companies to operate all over the world without regulation, without control. And they have forced all countries all over the world to open up their economies. So what they call the integration of the global economy is more correctly called the opening up in order to enable transnational corporations and investors to operate. And of course they have benefited enormously because there's no controls, no regulations, and they have the whole world as their field of operation. So what alternative policies? Certainly we cannot have free trade, which has destroyed small producers all over the world. We cannot have a continuation of unregulated investment and investors. We cannot have a continuation of financial speculation, enabling them to play currencies across the world. And we must stop the deregulation of labor markets, which enable the transnational corporations to exploit workers all over the world and to make them compete with each other. And we must stop privatization, which has taken social services, which should be a right of all people, to health and education and public transport and housing, which was part of government responsibility at national and local levels to provide these services. And these have been taken away and have either been commercialized, which means they must operate according to business criteria, or they have been completely privatized, that is, put in the hands of big corporations. So all these things we know have had very negative effects on people, on countries, economies, and on the global environment. So alternatives, there is no simple blueprint, and we must be careful about trying to create one blueprint for all countries, because there are differences, geographical, economic, political, cultural, social, in different parts of the world. But we know that we cannot continue in the way that the world has been for the last 20, 30 years of savage capitalism.
That means the end of capitalism, or that means another sort of capitalism. What kind? Do we need another word for the economic in the future, or now?
Well, yes, we cannot continue to have the future of the world's people, and the global environment being left in the hands of business forces. Do you know that the neoliberal theorists talk about abstract things called markets, as if these are floating up in the air and electronic media. These are business people, corporations, entrepreneurs who are pursuing their own interests. And the idea that was always argued in neoclassical economics, that greed and pursuing your self-interest will have broader social positive effects, is a myth, and it has been exposed that pursuing your own interests means competing, undercutting, cheating, and that is what is happening in the world today. And that is what capitalism is about. It is about private motivation and individualism and competition and self-fulfillment, regardless of the effect on people, on countries, or the environment. And that is capitalism, and that has to be stopped. Now, what we call that will follow capitalism, it differs from country to country. You know, the indigenous people of Latin America, they use the expression necesitamos un sistema de bom viver. In many parts of Africa, we say we need a system which is based on Ubuntu, humanity. Okay, And in other parts of the world, they say we need a post-capitalist system called socialism.
It seems that nobody worries about the crisis in the third world. There is crisis in the third world?
Absolutely. Over the last 20, 30 years, since the beginning or the reinforcement of this new phase of globalization of capitalism, very authoritative international agencies have been analyzing the effects. United Nations agencies, even the World Bank, and they have established that there has been a very serious deterioration of the human development indicators of people in the world. You know, per capita income is a very gross, simplistic measure of people's situation. You must look at what is individual resources and income and so on. And the United Nations agencies have established that there are 2.7 billion, 2,700 million of the world's population living in absolute poverty. Okay? And even now, you know, the World Bank is not a radical institution at all, but they are saying under the current crisis of the last year, a further 155 million went further into poverty, okay? In Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And this year, another 53 million will go further into poverty, this poverty that we are describing. And if you want a very graphic illustration of what we mean by poverty, it is that people do not have enough to eat. We are not talking about whether they have equipment or cars or televisions, not enough to eat. 855 million people live under conditions of what is politely called food insecurity. The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization calls it food insecurity. Of these, 140 million are children who are not eating enough, which means they will not develop properly. Their brains will not develop, physically will not develop. And of these, you know, 60% of the hungry people in the world are in Africa. So when we're talking about Africa, Asia, and Latin America, which we do not call the third world now, we call the South, the global South. And of course there are representatives of the North in the South, the small rich people. And there are representatives of the South in the North, which is the poor in Europe and North America. But the situation is very bad, and it is going to continue to deteriorate in this coming year. And already we can see that many of these countries, and particularly in Africa, will be very, very badly affected by this crisis, because all these countries have been encouraged, have been pressurized by the IMF and World Bank to open up to international investment, to liberalize their financial markets, to open up to international trade, and to orientate their own economies to external trade. And now that, and to where? To export into the rich countries. And now that the rich countries are going into decline and slowdown and recession and possibly long-term depression of 10 years, this has very bad implications for countries which are dependent on exports. You can even see it in Japan. Japan is a heavily export-oriented economy, and the Japanese economy has been worse affected of all the industrialized economies. Europe is quite a highly self-sufficient market, although very dependent on international trade as well. But Europe has greater internal trade than international trade. So, you know, countries like Brazil, which are heavily dependent on exports, of agricultural exports, will be very badly affected and is becoming affected. And it will affect every country in the world.